Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this morning's IIF ESG webinar. We hope you're all staying healthy and safe. This new webinar series is designed to promote understanding of the rapidly evolving landscape for ESG disclosure and to help with alignment of efforts to measure and track climate finance. So during these webinars, we look at key policy and regulatory initiatives. We look at disclosure frameworks like the TCFD and SASB and GRI, and methodologies for measuring climate risk and portfolio alignment, things that we'll talk about during today's webinar. So joining us for the discussion today from Carbon 4 are Jean-Yves Wilmot, who is leader of the Finance Practice and Transition Risk Expert, Florian Gallo, who is a senior consultant and physical risk expert, and Marianne Vincent, who is head of business development. Thank you all very much for joining us. I'll open up with a few quick questions for Jean-Yves, after which he'll tell us more about Carbon 4's approach to climate data and how this can be used to understand climate risk across different companies and sectors. And after the presentation, there'll be a Q&A session where you can submit questions for the team via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many as we can. So just two quick logistical notes before we get started. First, to say that the discussion's on the record, press is in attendance, and we'll provide a video recording of this event afterwards. And then the questions can be submitted on the bottom of the screen. So, Jean-Yves, Florian, Marianne, please tell us, where are you joining us from today and how are you faring during this working from home business? I see a great babushka set of dolls behind you. Florian, there?
Yeah, I'm quite lucky to be able to work from home, and that's my house that you can see. Really a private setting now that we start to get used to during this lockdown period.
Yes, very interesting to see into people's homes. But you, Jean-Yves and Marianne, you look like you're in the office. Yeah.
Yeah, we're back at work. Quite happy to see some colleagues again after this 3 months lockdown period as well. But yeah, back at the office, almost business as usual for us now.
Yes, third day at the office. We learn to work at home, but yes, it's good to go back and see the colleagues.
Yeah, it's good to see a little bit of opening up for those of us who are still in our home offices here. So maybe just before you get started with the presentation, you can just tell us a few words about the general types of things that you're working on: carbon footprinting, reporting, tracking risks, managing risks. It's such an important topic in the sustainable finance world.
Carbon 4 is a group with two entities, Carbon 4 Consulting, that advise corporates on their climate strategy, so assessing the carbon footprint, implementing decarbonization pathways and action plan, also identifying risk, transition risk and physical risk for the corporates. And with this expertise, we founded Carbon 4 Finance, the data provider that use all this knowledge to have a large coverage of company with a bottom-up approach to identify both transition and physical risks. And this is dedicated to financial actors that want to analyze that portfolio in terms of climate performance, so the carbon footprint, in terms of contribution to the low carbon transition, and risk assessment, transition and physical risk.
Well, certainly understanding the carbon impact of your portfolios is a very hot topic. So and I know you have a lot of really interesting work to take us through. So why don't we go ahead and start your presentation? So
again, thank you very much, IIF, for shedding light on this very important topic. So I will introduce Carbon 4 Finance and what we can analyze on transition risk, and my colleague Florian will tell you about the physical risk. So I've already been on what we do. Most important thing to know is that this very detailed bottom-up approach that we have at the data provider side comes from the 13 years of expertise at the consulting side, working directly with issuers for all sectors, and then we can build this bottom-up approach that I will give you an overview today with my colleague Florian. So, as said before, we have two methodologies to analyze the physical risks. These two risks are recommended by the TCFD to be assessed. Of course, we know that climate can lead to major disruptions in the economy. And when I say major, it's kind of the size of what the COVID brought by on the markets, but maybe for longer terms. So it really is a game changer. And our two methodology, so the first one, on the transition risk, is called carbon impact analytics, CIA, and the second one on physical risk is called CRIS, climate risk impact screening. We have declined these two methodology on all asset classes. So of course, we cover the listed securities with a database approach, but we also decline these methodologies on unlisted asset classes like infrastructure, on which there is a lot of stakes also, because the climate of tomorrow depends on the infrastructure of today. So the new infrastructure that we build need to be both compliant with the carbon budget, to be compliant with the Paris Agreement, and resilient to the physical risk, and also on the real estate and the private equity side. The main outcome of these methodologies are scoring that enables risk management, that enables also stress tests, so there can be an input of stress test methodologies, and that then can also be used for reporting to the different stakeholders. So let's start with the transition risk. And so the transition risk depends on the emissions, the greenhouse gases emissions, because the definition of transition risk is that companies that are not compliant with their carbon budget will have constraint from the market, from the regulation, and so the less they comply with this carbon budget, the more they're at risk. So we need to assess their carbon footprint to know how far they are from their carbon budget today and in the future. And this carbon footprint and these emissions are on the whole value chain. Let me take an example. A car manufacturer, it has energy consumption in their factory to assemble the car. So this is one emission sources of its carbon footprint for a car manufacturer. But it will need a lot of input of raw materials or material to build a car. So it will depend on a lot of industry, a lot of suppliers that will also use energy and emit greenhouse gases. And also their clients that will use the car will also emit greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And both what happens in the factory, but also in the upstream and the downstream side will impact the business. And the transition risk for this company is at first on their downstream side, meaning make efficient cars that will have a lower carbon footprint and be compliant with the carbon budget. Then to have light cars that will not use a lot of materials to be produced. And thirdly, only at the third position, the performance of the factories. And in fact, in terms of carbon accounting, the factories are called the scope 1 and 2 emissions, and the indirect emissions, both upstream and downstream, is called the scope 3. So what you need to remind here is that most of the transition risk for some sectors are hidden in the scope 3. And so it's necessary to assess the scope 3 to capture the whole risks of companies. And that is one of the core parts of carbon impact analytics, the methodology used to assess the transition risk. Secondly, if you only look at the carbon footprint, what we call the induced emissions that goes into the atmosphere, you can avoid some companies, you can avoid the fact that some companies are contributing positively with, for example, efficient products, efficient services, and also companies that are necessary for the economy, like cement, like steel, but they have a high carbon footprint, but they are reducing their carbon intensity. And so they are compliant with their carbon budget, even if they have a lot of emissions. And these kind of companies will lead to opportunities in a carbon constrained world. So we need to assess for what we call the emission savings to capture also the opportunities linked to these companies. Let me take a simple example. If I compare a company A, which is an oil and gas company, and a company B, which produce insulation materials for buildings. If I look only at scope 1 and 2 emissions, so they're the factories, the company 1 will have a smaller carbon footprint in terms of CO2 per million euro revenues, because it needs a lot of energy to produce these insulation materials. What we do, so that are scope 1 and 2 data only that you can find, for example, in the reports, because scope 3 is not well disclosed by a company. And if they do, they often forget a lot of emission sources and often the most significant. So what we do to have an overview of the whole and the complete carbon performance of the company, we have the scope 3. And for the oil and gas company, it's the use of their sold products, the fuels burned by their clients. For company B, it will be rather small, and you will see that it's more intuitive. Company A will have a higher carbon footprint than company B. But what we will also assess for is that company B is helping clients to reduce their energy consumption, and then they will avoid emissions. So we will assess for the emission savings due to improved energy efficiency for their clients. And that will be the core of the methodology to assess both from risk on the whole value chain and opportunities on the whole value chain, to be able to identify within one sector what are the companies that are the more at risk, what are the companies that have the most opportunities in a carbon constrained world. Then we also need to have a forward-looking analysis and especially look at the targets of companies. Let me take also an example, BP, that we speak a lot about now, that claims to go to net zero. And in detail, they have 5 aims, and in that 3 aims that regards the carbon footprint. So to be net zero on their operations. Secondly, net zero on the oil and gas production, and on the products, they have a 50% cut of the carbon intensity. That's their claims. And so the question we have when we look at this company is, if it is net zero and it is by 2050, it is compliant with the Paris Agreement, meaning they shouldn't have a lot of transition risk. But that's not so easy. So what we do is to assess into detail the impact of these targets. So the first thing we do is to calculate the current carbon footprint for 2019. They have the carbon footprint of their operations, the scope 1 and 2. The production, the carbon footprint linked to the fuel that they produce, so the use of the produced fuel, It's scope 3 downstream. Also, the use of the products they supply, so the refined products, and they have also a trading activity. And it's a lot of ton of CO2. I won't go into detail of the figures, but that's a lot. Then, to assess the carbon neutrality targets, we refer to the Net Zero Initiative, which is a framework that describes what is a science-based neutrality for companies. And the main idea is that to comply at the company level with the neutrality, a company needs to comply with a planet level neutrality. So with the scenario. And to comply with the scenario, they must decrease their emissions in line with this scenario. So here we take an example of the International Energy Agency scenario, the beyond 2 degrees, which lead to carbon neutrality in 2060. And we look where BP should be in 2050 if they comply with this scenario. And it is this level of emissions that BP should be in 2050, says the IEA scenario. Then if we look at their targets on the supply, they cut by 50% on the carbon intensity of the products. So assuming that they don't increase their production, and that's a strong assumption, it leads to emission there. And then we look at the net zero, the 1 and 2 aims. In fact, we don't know in this net zero target what is linked to a carbon reduction and what is linked to offsetting. And problem is that without knowing that, we can argue that BP is compliant with the scenario, because if they only do offsetting, it's not compatible with the planet neutrality, because everyone cannot offset their emissions. They first need to be in line with their sectoral pathway. So BP needs to precise their targets to prove that they're in line with the Paris Agreement. And actually, that's what they pledged to do in September. So we need to meet in September to assess better their targets, but yet it's not sufficient to say it's real carbon neutrality in line with scenarios. Of course, I don't speak of the trading because they do not mention that in their targets. So carbon offsetting does not prevent from stranded assets. And if BP wants to avoid the stranded assets, they need to comply with the scenario. We don't know that yet. Last point we do when we assess the company is to produce a rating based both on the induced emissions, the emission savings, so the risk, the opportunities, the current risk and opportunities, and the forward-looking analysis. That's the scoring for the transition risk. I will let my colleague Florian the floor for the physical risk assessment.
Thank you very much, Jean-Yves. Let's talk about physical risk, and let's talk about the climate risk impact screening methodology, aka CRIS. Quite catchy, we think so at least. So when we talk about physical climate risk, things that you might have in mind, but it's good to remind that physical climate risk is actually the result of two main components. On the one side, the climate hazard, so the natural part of the risk analysis, and this climate hazard is linked to two things mainly. So the evolution of climate itself, for example, the evolution of rainfall, but it's also linked to what we call here aggravating or predisposing context, what's happening on the ground. For example, is an asset located in a flood-prone area? Is an asset located in a densely populated area? That's going to be some predisposing context. And on the other side, climate risk is linked to the vulnerability of the asset, and that's really depending on the asset specificities. So if we look at a real estate portfolio, for example, it's going to be linked to the building's technical specificities. And if we look at the corporate portfolio, it will be linked to the sector of activities of the different company. And from this information, we generate a climate risk rating from 1 to 100. That's the little scale that you have on the top of the slide. And this climate risk rating will be generated for every climate hazard for every company. So how do we do that for a given company? So I will focus on corporate right now, but the idea and the general methodology would be exactly the same for different asset classes. So for a given company, we have to look at two things again, climate hazard and vulnerability. So we have to look at the location of the company's activities, and we have to look at the type of activities, the sector of activities. And in this example, we have a company operating in 2 countries and in 3 different sectors. So we will calculate the climate risk rating for every hazard in every country and for every sector. And then we will aggregate all these risk ratings for one climate hazard, depending on the sectoral breakdown and the geographical breakdown of the company's activities. And with that, we are able to calculate climate risk rating for a company for one given hazard. A quick word about climate data. So I was talking about climate hazard. The CRIS methodology covers 7 climate hazards. So 4 acute hazards linked to heat waves, drought, rainfall extremes, and storms, and 3 chronic hazards, increase in average temperature, sea level rise, and the changes in rainfall patterns linked to water resources. And associated with these direct hazards will be what I was mentioning earlier, the predisposing context. So the risk of flood, the risk of landslide in a mountainous area, coastal risk, for example, if you're close to the coast. So that's for the climate hazard database, and we will calculate again climate risk ratings for every single one of these 7 hazards. On the vulnerability side, so vulnerability is assessed at the sector level for a total of 60 sectors in CRIS. And again, it's assessed for every single hazard. So we will have a total of 60 by 7, so 420 vulnerability ratings in the database. And the vulnerability assessment is based on what we call here vulnerability factors or vulnerability criteria that are actually describing the dependencies of an activity to different things. So that can be the dependencies to its supply chain, the dependencies to long-lived assets that are quite capital intensive, the dependencies to natural resources such as water. And based on the one side, these vulnerability criteria, and on the other side, the potential impacts of every climate hazard on every single part of the value chain, we are able to generate what we call the vulnerability ratings for every climate hazard and for every sector. So that was a lot of information in just a few minutes, and maybe it will be a bit clearer with an example. So if we move to the next one, we will actually go back to BP, but now we're going to look at BP's exposure to physical climate risk. So if I try to go back to my sectoral and geographical breakdown, when we look at BP's, that's a simplified example for the sake of illustration today. But BP's is mainly operating in 2 different sectors that we call exploration and production for fossil fuel here, and the other one that we call integrated services, which correspond for BP to the refining activities and the distribution of the fuels and gases. And BP is also operating in 19 countries over the world. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you have the list here. And the idea is, again, to look at the risk rating for these 2 sectors in these 19 countries to assess every risk rating for BP's operation in the future. So just a quick summary of the type of results that you can have, and we will be able to reply to all questions later. So on the left side of the slide, you have, again, the geographical and sectoral breakdown. So for example, you see that exploration and production accounts for almost 2/3 of the activities of BP, and the services only 1/3 here. And by mixing these two breakdowns, we can calculate the different results that you can see on the right side of the slide. So for example, the main one that you can see in the middle, you have the 7 different climate risk ratings for the 7 different climate hazards: temperature rise, heat waves, droughts, etc. And you can see, for example, here that for BP's, so these numbers are for 2050 and for a medium emission scenario. We calculate numbers for different time horizon and different climate scenario. But for BPs for 2050, the main risk is linked to sea level rise, actually. We'll go back to that later. From these 7 climate risk ratings, you can generate what we call the overall risk rating by averaging the different hazards together. And that's the 35 that you can see on the slide. Not sure that this number is the most interesting number that we can generate, but if you need one single number for one company for reporting purposes, for example, that could be the one that you can use. So the 35, so moderate risk for BPs overall in 2050. And below that, you also have the evolution of this overall risk for the different climate scenarios. So that's the different line that you have, and also the different time horizon, 2050 and the end of the century. And you can see that following the business as usual, the +4, +5 degrees scenario at the end of the century, BP will be exposed to a risk rating of 52 out of 100.
And I think there's a great deal of interest in your methodology and understanding it a bit better around the scope 3 area. So one question is, how do you calculate scope 3 if it's not disclosed by the company itself? So that's one question. And then also on scope 3, are there accepted standards for defining and allocating it on an industry or region or country basis? And if there aren't standards, what is the status of the dialogue on defining scope 3? So it's clearly a very complex area.
Yes, I can take these two questions. On the second one, there is a standard, which is called the GHG protocol, and that defines what is scope 1, 2, and 3, and in the scope 3, what are the different categories. So the standard is international. And on the first question, how we calculate the scope 3, and we always recalculate the scope 3 to ensure a consistency within the methodology and perimeter for one sector. We base our calculation based on physical flows, so the barrel oil equivalent for this sector. So we take the volumes and translate it into CO2.
And then a couple more methodological questions. For example, when you're looking at heavy rainfall, what kind of data are you using? Because global climate models might not be suitable for specific regions. So that's another question.
So all the climate data that we are using is coming from global climate models. So from a set of, depending on the variable, 5 to 15 global climate models. And there are limitations to these models. There are uncertainties in this model. We definitely agree. And for extreme events, these models are not as good in some region than they are in other. That's clearly a limitation. The way, I mean, the reason we use global climate model and not regional one that might be better at processing and representing some of the climate processes in some region is that we want to have something that is consistent throughout the whole world. And comparing different regional climate models that will not be the same on different continents, for example, there would be more reliable on the continents, but there would be less consistent among them. That's why we are using global climate model. But we agree that that's one of the limitations when using global climate model. Depending on the variable and depending on the climate indicators and the type of risk, the reliability of climate data is not exactly the same. But all the information that we have from the climate point of view is based from global climate models, same one that are used in IPCC's publication, for example. But we agree with that, yeah.
So I think all of these questions, and I'm sorry that we have more that we can't get to, they're really highlighting the challenges that you're trying to address and the interesting methodologies that you're working with. So I am afraid we're at the end of our time today. We'll have to have you back to take this further. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your modeling, your presentation. And we will look forward to future discussions. Thank you.